Conversation, Dr. Francois.
Yes, it is. Good evening, everyone. We are so grateful for your presence today. Grateful for another opportunity on a Woke Wednesday to share some of our thinking, to share some of our imagination, political imagination around the 2020 election, around how we should be thinking about organizing Black people in America for this particular election, for this time where being counted is of premium importance as we think about the census that needs to be completed, so that certain resources go into our communities that also help to supplement our educational experiences, but also thinking about this election, those persons who are deputized to represent our children, our students, our families, our educators on local school boards, to even who becomes the next Secretary of Education for the United States. So this is an important time for us to think deeply about education, particularly the role of public education and how it either furthers or hinders democracy in our country. We are very clear that in many cities, particularly where Black and brown bodies predominate, where Black and brown families are at the center of public life, that those schools often have been economically abandoned. Those systems have been politically neglected. And it's important as we think about what it means to organize Black America for this very consequential election. It's important to put on the table the role of education, the role of schools. And so tonight's conversation is called Just Schools. Education equity and 2020. And there's so many things related to 2020. Not only are we thinking about the election, but we're also thinking about what does it mean for families to trust their children, to trust their loved ones to public school systems in the middle of a pandemic. So 2020 is deeply loaded. It is beyond just the polls, but it is really thinking about how the polls intersect with lived experience, how they intersect with what it means to keep families protected and alive. What we know is that there are so many families who are suffering from zip code injustice. You can often tell, it is said, that you can actually tell someone's life expectancy more so by their zip code than you can any semblance of a genetic code. And so when we talk about schools, we know that obviously it's a national issue, but schools are deeply local. Schools are vulnerable to zip code injustice, to the types of local apartheids that exist in major areas, major cities across the country. And we are joined today by two experts in education who think about policy, but also think about familial engagement, and also about educator morale, and also just the infrastructure of schools themselves. I'm grateful to be joined by Kenya Bradshaw, who's the Vice President of Policy and Community Coalitions at TNTP, at the New Teacher Project. Is that still your role there? That's the last thing I heard. So she's a boss in the education sphere, and she's a lifelong activist. She was woke before woke was sexy, and so we are happy to not only have her on the show today for Freedom Summer, but we're also grateful that she's been out here on the front line fighting many issues of justice on behalf of learners and families and abandoned communities for so many years. So thank you, Kenya, for being with us today. And we have Dr. Robert S. Harvey, who is the superintendent of the East Harlem Scholars Academies in New York City, there in the section of Harlem that is known as East Harlem. He has given significant leadership there in creating, not just maintaining schools, but creating schools. He has a track record of building schools in low income, low wealth, no wealth communities for Black and brown folk, and he has transferred that work from the South to the North to Middle America, and we're grateful to have him in the Northeast now, as he is giving really peerless leadership for education to a very diverse constituency in the nation's most dense part of the country. So happy to have both of them on today. And they've already started this conversation prior to us pressing go live. And so I really don't want to colonize the conversation with my outside perspective because these are people who live in the ed space on a daily basis. And as much as I see myself as an ally for education justice movements, these are people who live in that space. And so I'm just going to turn it over to Kenya just for some opening general comments about where we are, the state of public education, what should be on our radar, how do we think about mobilizing for education equity in the middle of a pandemic in one of the greatest, in one of the most clearly racially divided times in our country. So Kenya, whatever you got to tell us as opening comments, we will be most grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Francois. So for me, as I told them when we were looking in the green room, is that like I'm so grateful to be a part of this Freedom Sober conversation because I always feel like my soul is being fed as well as my brain is being pushed. So I'm just grateful to be here and in relationship with y'all. And then y'all gonna be blessed when y'all hear Dr. Harvey and the stuff that he's doing. So I just want to say that before I even start. But I yesterday for me was just a really powerful moment for us in our country with Sister Kamala Harris being nominated by Joe Biden as the vice presidential nominee. And so I think for us as a community, I don't think that we can ignore where there is room to grow in in her policies and positions, but we have to be careful not to let our wokeness get us in trouble around like the racism and the sexism that we are facing as America, and to not have a plan. And so for me, that's where education plays a huge role in where we need to be focusing on. Typically, we wait for someone to tell us like what is the agenda. And this is an opportunity for us to really be proactive around what do we want to see going forward as we are in the middle of multiple pandemics. So while COVID is a pandemic, we are also in the middle of an economic pandemic that is hitting our communities even harder than anyone else. And so as we've always said, if white folks catch a cold, we got the flu. And so like that's what's really happening in our communities right now. And while we're having housing crises at the same time in our communities that we're not talking about, that impact our students and their mobility, even being able to have access to great education. And so those are pieces that we need to be thinking about. And this presents us an opportunity to be able to innovate. And we also don't need to leave behind the window that the other pandemic of lifting up racial strifes in our country and exposing racism gives us a window to talk about in education. So one of the big things for us around this that I've been thinking about is the school to prison pipeline, and how do we not let that go as we're thinking about criminal justice reform. And we can do some work around police reform, but really at the root of that, police are not the first people who actually call or push our children into the school to prison pipeline. We need to think about the training that teachers receive and the biases that teachers and school leaders have around Black and brown children in particular that lead them into that funnel. And then the last piece that I would just really flag is around the opportunity to innovate. Our families now are the primary deliverers or supporters of education for their children. How do we think about how we deconstruct what education is and how it should be delivered? We've known for a long time that the system has not fully supported all of our children. The difference is we've allowed that to take place because we didn't know we could have anything different. What I believe that COVID shows us is, one, things can be different. We wouldn't have thought 6 months ago, hey, everybody could be home and we could still have digital learning. We've been saying for years that everyone couldn't access that. So how do we think about, oh, if we know that, then should children in California be getting access to high quality, innovative curriculum, and children in Mississippi not be getting access to that? And so how can we really break down some of those equity walls that we've known that have been existing for so long? And how do we use our voices to really push for that? So for me, those are some of the big pieces that I think that we have a unique opportunity to be able to really push on. And there are resources available. So there are huge grants for people who want to create pods or want to do schools. So this is a window for us to think about how we support our communities with innovation, having a plan, and also dismantling some of the inequities that have existed for so long.
Dr. Harvey?
Yeah, I appreciate being here. Love being in conversation with all of you all. I was telling Kenya when we started honoring the work that they do at TNTP and how it has been crucial to some of the equity innovation work that we're doing around compensation for adults in our community. I think Kenya lifted up something that I don't think we can let go loosely, which is this idea of the intersectionality between education and other civil rights issues, right? I've been spending a lot of time reading about Spanish flu of 1918. And what has informed a lot of how I've thought about this work is me reading history. And kind of the secret passion of mine, and Dr. Francois knows this, is I like to situate myself in historical context always. And in the 1918 Spanish flu, there's a ton of what we learned, but something that President Woodrow Wilson said in 1918 that I think is critical now is, he said, education is important, and yet what is education if you are not alive, right? It's this idea of intersecting the connection that life and health are directly connected to educational outcomes. And so we have an opportunity right now to really engage in a broader conversation, and Kenya said it, around what does education and epidemiology mean, right, for public health in this country? What does public health mean and education mean for clean air, right? What does public education mean for incarceration movements? What does public education mean in literally every other civil rights issue? And this election does that for us. The reason that this is such a poignant moment, I think, in the education space is not just because of the intersectionality that needs to happen innovatively, but there's also a host of intersectional legislation coming down the pipeline in 2020 that's going to impact schools if we don't begin to really think about it. I think about the fact that we've been having a decade-long conversation around fully funding the Individual with Disability Education Act, IDEA, and yet there are still gaps of funding in IDEA being funded because you have a Secretary of Education who's using funds that could go to close the gap in IDEA, and instead is filtering that money in the height of an intersectional crisis to private and religious schools who we know already disproportionately have access to resources, right? So this election is such a critical moment because when that intersection happens, where you have a socioeconomic disproportion happening with public education, with our current secretary, who is a millionaire, billionaire in office, this election forces us to pause and ask the questions of where does public education cross over into other rights issues, and how do we, and can you say it, how do we hold folks like Kamala? Listen, I am pumped for the ticket, and at the same time, I want to hold the ticket accountable, right? Of how do we say, in light of what we know is true about criminal justice, Obama's administration started moving the needle on non-discrimination discipline policies and non-discrimination punitive measures. They started the needle, but they backed up off of it, right? And they backed up off of it because they got a lot of pushback. How do we lean deeper on a Biden-Harris administration to say, we got to go full throttle with non-discriminatory school discipline? Because if we go full throttle with non-discriminatory school discipline, we should see a leveling out by race in what's happening with suspension and expulsion rates. And if we level out by race, suspension and expulsion rates, we can level out prison hell, right? Like, I mean, it's literally about holding them accountable, but it starts with something as mundane as, can we just not discriminate when a kindergartner gets suspended and a third grader? Can we not discriminate between when a white pre-K gets kicked out and a black pre-K gets kicked out, right? That's an education conversation, but it has mass incarceration implications because that begins the trajectory of that child knowing that discipline is their response and punitive measures are their response to just being human. So I'll stop there. But like that is the urgency of this moment, is it is so intersectional for me.
And Dr. Harvey, for me, you are so right, because at the root of a lot of this is the system and how we've set it up, based upon property taxes being the way that we say we value education. And property in poor communities is already undervalued. And so if we continue to build a system based upon a faulty measure, then we're going to continue to have these challenges. And so how do we think differently at all ends? We know there are so many things possible. So how are we audacious in what we're asking of our communities and what we need to change right now?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great question for us to or it leads to a great question for when we think about funding, right? Because part of, I was setting this idea up of zip code injustice, how, most people live in these deeply concentrated communities of disinheritance, or these deeply concentrated communities of wealth. And that tends to shape how our schools are funded. So I'm going to toss this to you, Kenya, is what would a truly radically equitable funding proposal look like in the United States, right? That's not contingent upon property taxes, not contingent upon the whims or the competencies of state legislators or federal legislators, but how can we start ensuring funding equity in this country as a relationship between state, local, and federal?
So the reason that this is so important is because we know that it's possible. So we don't depend on states to fund our military, because we said being safe as a country is of critical importance to us. And so we have a model. So why don't we think about how we fund military, how we think about the training of military, and then we replicate that model on a local level. And so instead of us saying that the federal government is only going to put 8% of funding into how we're funding schools, what if we inverted that and said half of funding is going to come from the federal government, because we think that this is paramount to our country's national security. And we think that the education of our people is such an invaluable asset. We are going to take a greater role as a federal government in funding our systems. So for me, it ain't even that radical, Willie. I'm just saying, do what you do on issues that you think is a public safety. And so for me, and I think we know models. You go look internationally. We can go and identify models around how countries say that they're going to educate all of their members, because they know that it has to do with their long-term positionality and their country's wealth. And so that presents the opportunity for us right now. Also, even in the training, like if we believe that teachers are essential, then we need to centralize some of the training of them, to ensure that we have great quality of teaching. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't have university. It just means that we are not going to have like these abstract requirements where we say some people get access to good teachers and some people don't. We are actually going to say, no, we think it's a basic right for every child to have access to great teachers. So we're going to invest in that, just as we would to say we think that all military personnel should be really equipped with these skills. So I think we have a model and we can recreate it.
I think so. Kenya hit something that if I can add to it, Dr. Francois,
please.
Is the fact that 80% of funding comes from property taxes to our schools, right? So that is a clear issue. But here's what blew my mind last year. Right now, the federal government spends about $79 to $77 billion K through 12 education, right? So we're talking primary, secondary program. Let's call it 78. Split the difference, 78 billion. About $410 billion is given philanthropically, not including your Gates, Bezos, etc. So regular, ordinary folks, us, who make a salary, given $410 billion in philanthropy, $78 billion is the budget for K-12 schools. What does it look like? And Kenya hit something I would love to push us to think about, which is in New York City, we have something called the Public Fund for New York City Schools, a philanthropic fund that philanthropists give into, and it helps to fund innovative ideas. St. Louis Public Schools has the fund for St. Louis Public Schools. Chicago, the fund for is a philanthropic body that cultivates innovation, social entrepreneurship, that funds unique projects. Hell, DC, the reason DC was able to really push their freshman program forward to have those major success rates in freshman programming like Chicago had, because they have a separate philanthropic fund where philanthropists funnel money to fund innovation in public school context. What does a U.S. public schools fund look like, where we hold people like Gates and Bezos and Ford Foundation and Carnegie, who I respect, and all the rest of them, right? These people that I work with, and say, listen, we have a U.S. fund for public education. We are expecting 20% of every philanthropic gift you make every fiscal year to be put in the U.S. fund for public schools, right? And if we begin to make a declaration where we say, y'all are signing these, I'm gonna give away half of my wealth before you die. We need it while you are alive, right? We want to hold you to 10% while you are alive, and that 10% goes directly to public schools. If we were able to move that $79 billion up to about $100 billion in K through 12 spending, what Kenya talked about, every major urban city could have a teacher residency program where we put high quality teachers in. Every major city could have fully funded pre-K4 and pre-K3 schools if we just move that up by $21 billion. And Kenya's hit it. We find money, and if we can't find it, we create money for the military. We literally create unbacked money if our military needs it. We can create unbacked money for our school system if we really prioritize key innovations. Teacher preparation and readiness, which we know is the number one indicator of student success. And then secondly, kindergarten readiness, which means get those babies when they are 2 and 3 publicly, make it a federal requirement that at 3 you are put into somebody's learning center, so that by the time you are kindergarten, you're already decoding, you know vocab, you can identify letter, you have a phonemic understanding. And again, like Kenya said at the end, hell, this ain't really that innovative. This just requires intentionality.
It's not that radical. What we're talking about is not that radical.
No, it's not that radical. But here's the problem. It's not that radical, but we haven't done it since Jefferson created public schools in 1700. It's radical in the sense that it's taken us 300-some years and we still haven't done it.
You know, Rob, I want to hear you say a little bit more about this, and Kenya, please jump in as well. Is that, I mean, this proposal about how the federal government should be absolutely fully funding education in some way, right? That's one of the calls of the Black Church Action Fund is that we should have 100% funded schools by the federal government, because we know the money's there, right? And obviously there are politics connected to that. But some of this, Dr. Harvey, I've heard you talk about John Dewey was calling for some of this work at some point. Can we just talk about, just for a moment, can we put this in historical context about how long have our public schools looked and functioned this way? And what does that mean about America that our public schools have functioned this way for this long, right? Because John Dewey's a name. I just heard Thomas Jefferson, the creator of our current system. Like we're talking about founding ideologies, founding practices of this nation. What does it mean that there hasn't been a radical shift in structure and funding since the nation's real inception?
Yeah, so this is the challenge, right? So Jefferson in the 1770s, 1780s proposed the model that we have right now of we need to stratify folks between two classes, the learned and the worker. You talk about America declared independence in 1776. Immediately after independence, Jefferson said, if we want to make this thing work, we need a couple of people who do the work and we need a couple of people who think about the work, right? And we need to break people off into these two classes. So Dewey then leans into this model in the 1800s, late 1800s, and we adopt, and Kenya can, I have no doubt TNTP could unpack this better than I can, is we then appropriated a grading system that was created for higher education, right? This 100-point letter-based grading system was a higher education creation that was created for folks like Yale and Harvard, for them to identify who was going to pick which track. We adopted it in K-12 and started assigning kids A, B, C, D, and F. It wasn't invented to assess the performance of little people, right? We were never supposed to be assessing a 5-year-old with a 1, 2, 3, or 4. That was not the original intent of public education. The original intent of public education from an abolitionist perspective, now this, let me poke here, from an abolitionist perspective, the original intent of public education was to free people enough to decide if I want to be a learner or if I want to be a worker, right? It is about giving people enough tools and assets to make the same decision. But Dewey and Jefferson took away agency and created a system where you don't get to decide. So can you hit it? Property taxes mean I don't really get to decide if I want to be a learner or a worker. I am intentionally put into a context where I am walking down the worker pathway and I got to fight like hell to become a learner, right? I got to actually be willing to do extra work to get out of the pathway that was intended for me. Public health. If I don't have access to high quality health care, I'm disproportionately at risk for higher diseases, which means my attendance rate is going to drop. As my attendance rate drops, colleges will think that I don't have student engagement. If I don't have student engagement, I don't get accepted. And what path am I back on? The worker pathway, right? Like we have literally built a model with every system we have in place to ensure that we stratify people by Jefferson's original two classes in the 1700s. You either will be a worker or you will be a learner. And this is my one critique of Du Bois. Well, not my one, but it's my most pronounced critique of Du Bois. And then Du Bois bought into it with a talented 10th model by saying like Kenya, Willie, and Robert, they can be learners because they work out of being workers, but everybody else shouldn't expect to be one. No, abolition says you get to pick what you want to be. You get to decide if you want to be a worker or if you want to be a learner. But unfortunately, the entire model has restricted that level of decision making. I'll stop there. Can you hop in?
Come on, Prophet. Like that's where we have to be careful about some of the conversations around our children aren't ready for college or career, or we need to be thinking about CTE more. I don't have a problem with CTE. The problem that I have is what I think is that every child should be prepared to then take whichever path they want to go instead of us predetermining which path that they should go on. We know from brain development research that children are not even cognitively fully developed mentally, especially boys, until they're 21. So if we know those things, then why are we perceiving that, oh, we should be assigning your long-term class? And this is a class issue, so we can call it all kind of other things, but this is where we have built up a class system in our country, we just don't call it Brahmins or different things like that. We have now said you're either going to be poor, and there is really no middle class. So stop believing the illusion that there are some people who fall into this category, or
Right.
the ultra wealthy. And so schools have been the vehicle for which we have still been segmenting. Some people are allowed to transcend their class and others are not. And so, how do we dig into this more and try to think about what if we repair a system? Because while, yes, the educational system was built in 1700, we know for Black people, we did not enter into that system at the same time.
Right, right.
Us entering into that system still was not intended for all of us to be educated. And so we are trying to create something that the system never was really intended for, to educate all of the people. And so that is where the innovation comes in for me. Like, what can we do to be able to make sure at the end of this grand experiment, everyone has choices? For me, that is the critical piece. I have a choice around how I want my life to be directed after I have been given knowledge. And now with that knowledge, I am equipped to be able to help define the direction for me and my family going forward. That is not what we measure the success of education by. Because if we did that, then that we would call into question, why do children who come from X school, when they go into college, they are forced to take remedial courses? We would begin to call fraud on that. If children if you were going to a medical institution and 30% of your people were still sick, like, we would call into question some of the product that you are producing. And so we say, oh, well, we can't control that. No, we actually can. We can do more than what we are doing right now. And that's where I'm saying push against, like, the narratives, oh, well, college isn't for all. Well, everybody might not choose it, but what we have a responsibility to do is prepare every child for that to be a choice.
Yeah. I mean, Kenya, it's so interesting I love that you talked about where Black folks enter into the public conversation. This was the project of folks like Mary McLeod Bethune that was then by folks now like Children's Defense Fund, Mary Wright Edelman, right?
Mary Wright Edelman.
The idea of creating the landscape of choice being important. So late last year, the senior minister for Singapore came and spent some time with us for an entire day at my network. So we spent the day together, and we got into this conversation around Singapore and how they built their public education system. 99% funded public education dollars, tax, let's be clear, 99% funded by the government, with a 98% literacy rate, 99.2% math rate. Let's not go there. So he and I got into this conversation. I said, tell me, like, what are your 4 driving initiatives? Like, how do you think about public education in Singapore, which for a period of time was considered the lower rung of
Asia?
Yeah, Asia, right? You had Singapore, and you had Philippines, and those were considered the bottom of the barrel. So I said, what did you all do? And Kenya, you hit it. He said the first thing we did was we began to ask a question of everything we did and every initiative we implemented. We asked one question: how does this ensure choice amongst 3 pathways? Lifelong learning. I want to continue in school. I want to do a trade or career route, or I want to go back and support my family without either one. He said, we kept asking ourselves, how do we build an economy where all 3 options are successful?
Exactly.
And I said, that is rich. I said, what else? He said, then we pillared that by saying, after you decide which route you want to take, we create opportunities for lifelong learning that have no degree attached, but have economics attached, right? Where they dove into the micro-credential market as early as what we would call 6th grade. What does it look like when I'm in 6th grade to be introduced to a micro-credential because I'm just interested in something, right? I just love robots. I just love dinosaurs. And I want to go deeper in this area. But it's not about college. It's not about career. It's about cultivating a cognitive interest because, like, can you say it? I'm still so young in my mind. I just need time to go deep into an area. One thing that I proposed, and I told my board this, so they already know, so they wouldn't be too offended. Because I told my board, I would love by the time I'm done in my role for us to add grade 13 that is required in our network. That we don't have a senior year, that every child in our network takes a grade 13. Because I'm convinced that all of us need another year after we've gotten through the Common Core, after we've taken the Regents, after we've done all of the federalized standard stuff, where we take a year in the comfort of the community that we trust already. Let's be clear, right? So I'm gonna pay for it, but we're gonna pay for it as an organization. But we can give you one more year to just figure out you. Right? No classes are attached to this. No grades are attached to this. There are no standards attached to this. But we have thought about a grade 13 where we take you on a journey over grade 13 to just be clear on who you are as a human. Right? How do you make decisions? How do you talk about the world? How do you imagine life? How do you think about your blackness? Right? When you leave us, you need to be able to defend why you are black and why you are Latinx and why you are gay. And like, we want that 13th year to give kids the time to just figure out their human construction. So I'm with you, Kenya. We pack too many expectations into a system that does not align with cognitive development. And we know that.
And we have narrowed the scope of what we think success is so much that it actually still does not prepare you. So we have now accepted mediocre as sufficient. And so if we know that, because let's talk, like, we know that most assessments are actually only assessing students' proficiency at an 8th grade level. There are some that are doing like 10th, but very few districts are actually assessing you on a college readiness level. And so if that's the case, we've already said we're okay with you all not actually being prepared, and we're going to measure our success by you being mediocre. And so for me, we are not a mediocre people, and we know that our children have greatness in them. And so what if we were giving them more than the standard of reading and writing and arithmetic, and we were actually like, you know what, our children deserve Mandarin. They deserve to be exposed to dinosaurs and all other things that we see in other places, but we have not determined that our children deserve those things. And so how are we intentional about giving our children access to that? And Dr. Harvard, I love a 13th year. We are actually seeing that happen in alternative models where they're like, oh, this baby ain't fully developed yet, or they need some extra time because they were having trouble in school. Right. So we keep them in a little longer. What if that was really the standard? Because we actually know, we use the science of what we know around child development and actually say, like, we're going to help support you. And it aligns with what parents have said they wanted. When I talk to parents across the country, they are actually not saying, oh, I want my baby to master ACT. They're like, oh, what I want is my child to be a good person and prepared for them to have a good life. And those are the measurements that we are trying to create. Then we are going to now say, give us your baby for another year. We're going to ensure now they have the opportunity to be able to choose a career path where they go and either work with someone else, or they have the skills necessary to be an entrepreneur, to work for themselves. They then either have the path to be able to say, no, I want to be civically engaged and I want to go do something else. Or we have equipped every child with some micro certification along the way of their interest. So, hey, I was interested in yoga, so I'm already a certified yoga teacher. I got those 100 hours already. Or what? I'm good at braiding. I've already gotten the certification and I still can go to college. And so we're going, like, if we built all of those things and said, yes, every child is going to get a micro credential or a CT. And it's not CTE in how we know it. There are kids in Alabama who do cybersecurity. Those babies make $80,000 in 2 grade.
Yeah.
And because they are doing the systems work, we can do this in a way that values and gives them skills, and they still get to continually learn. We as a community need to reinforce learning is attractive, and that's what all of our people need to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is particularly important. I mean, this 13th year really redefines what the privilege actually call that gap year, right? Because there are a lot of rich folk. I believe our most recent beloved president's daughter took one herself. I mean, there's something deeply and the intentions of that gap year is self-discovery, deeper maturation, an exploration of the unexplored regions of oneself, right? So I think to structure that in the very system, I think is an important concept, but it also causes me to think about how Parker Palmer, who's also not particularly an education equity person, but he does think about as a Quaker, as a proponent of democracy. He talks about these 5 habits of the heart that are cultivated in the classroom. He talks about the classroom as like this last bastion of real democratic formation.
Yes.
He talks about, that's where we come to learn that we're all in this together. That's where we go, that we see we have the capacity to create community. That's where we learn to lean into tension, into life-giving ways. He has 2 other ones that thinking about that. But the idea that education still is that one opportunity we have to shape small d Democrats, right? People who are committed to democracy, committed to civilization, and that's what's been coming up as I've been listening to you today. We gotta shut this down, but I need to hear respectively some policy proposals. How do we get there? Legislatively, and I mean, this could be local, this could be state, this could be federal. But what kind of policies help us get to this ideal that actually protects children and not leaves them behind? Either.
Kenya, I'll defer to you first.
So, Dr. Francois, I'll be honest. In my policy thinking right now, is really protectionist, and we're in a state of crisis. And so I am like, my mental space has been around, like, not even what I'm charging y'all with around innovation. It really has been around, how do we make sure that our children don't get less than in this moment in time? And so Dr. Harvey talked a little bit about like the IDA. Like, I'm deeply concerned that children who have special needs in our country right now, as we're going through this crisis, aren't going to get the support. So how do we push and monitor? So for me, one of the biggest things that we need to do is the spirit of questioning. And so call to question a lot of what's happening and asking for public transparency around how are you educating our children right now, and how are you educating all of our children, and not just being accepting of like, oh, we're doing virtual. What does that mean? How are you measuring the quality of what you are giving them? How will we know if they are successful throughout this year? Those are some of the questions. When I think about from the next landscape of what should we be thinking about in the future, I think right now we'll call in the question around, as I stated, around funding in general. Like, what are we thinking about funding on the local and the state level, and then also long term? So we know that during economic crises, it does not bounce back overnight. And so as a country, we still haven't recovered from our last Great Recession. And the places where we feel that first are in our school systems and in our districts. And so instead of us saying, hey, we're trying to bounce back an economy, or like, we need to be thinking about how do we shield our school districts from like the economic hardships that this crisis is going to exhibit for us, I would say for the next 10 years, which is really a whole a generation of children right now. So how do we think about that? And then the other is really, like Dr. Harvey said, around creating, for me, it's not an innovation, because I don't want people to get caught up in the word innovation. It is us doing right by our children fund, and we're going to create all of these other pieces in it so that we can actually do it. So creating a robust educational fund that really supports us thinking about how do we address the inequities that are happening in our school districts and being supported. And then lastly, for me, I know it seems like I'm harping on teacher quality, but the reason why is because what our teachers provide to our children is the experience. That's what is rooted down. We can change a whole bunch of the other pieces, but what we are at the core, it is the student teacher relationship and experience that defines education. So how do we do our best in being able to make sure we are building and supporting the best teachers? Because I think we have teachers everywhere. And so we can find them, support them. And this is a workforce opportunity for us. As many people, like restaurants are closing around the country, why don't we think about how we retool people to be able to go into education? And how do we support them so that they can be great teachers? And that, for me, could be the national clearing call, similar to how we did AmeriCorps, we did volunteer. Why don't we create a national teacher corps right now and in your locals or in your states to be able to support ensuring that every child gets a great teacher? One of the things that I'll end with this, I was in Cincinnati recently, and a family I was talking to, I was like, what made you choose this school? The family was like, we're getting a great experience, but more importantly, it is a very small student teacher ratio. And I know years ago, I was one of those people who said student teacher ratios don't matter. And like that was me. So I own what I believed. And I now don't believe that anymore. And I believe in particular for Black and brown children who have not gotten the educational foundation, we actually need to be thinking much more about smaller class sizes and smaller student teacher ratio. I think in more advanced courses, you can. If you are teaching AP calculus, we could potentially do a 1-to-100 student teacher ratio in there because you have now mastered some concepts and you can do independent thinking and independent learning. But when we are trying to give foundational skills, we need to be thinking more around how are we doing smaller, more customized experience and learning for our students. So that's what I would say we can push on. And calling the question on what's happening in your local community and asking for transparency is so important right now. Dr. Harvey, come on, bring it home.
Yeah, no. So I think you hit it. I think for me, I would ditto everything Kenya said. Legislatively, here's where I push. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Is this idea of what would it look like to tell foreign governments that if you want to engage in our stock exchange, there is a required percentage of all revenues earned in America that must be put back into American public education. A. B. What does it look like to build a data tax? Since we know that kids represent some of the highest amounts of corporate data through TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, where each corporation that had access to children's data had to pay a tax per each child as it relates to public education fund. Like these two legislative pushes there. Thirdly, to Kenya's point, think about this idea of what would it look like to create a fund in every major urban city where philanthropists are required. An X amount of earnings that exceed blank is put immediately back into this rolling fund in order to do right by children through teacher innovation, through high quality literacy, and through making sure that every child has access to technology equipment. But then another piece of legislation is what would look to the federal government to mandate federal Wi-Fi in every corner of our nation. What would it look like to have a Wi-Fi infrastructure nationally supported where NSA stops listening and begins to build the infrastructure that it currently already has to hear us and to put that infrastructure in work to ensure that kids have access to high quality Wi-Fi? And then lastly, what does it look like to ensure legislatively that we implement an anti-bias approach to language federally, which means we no longer use words like expulsion. We completely eliminate words like suspension, and we call them community transfers, or we call them community remodeling, where we then take an opportunity to use asset-based language to completely rethink about the work that we currently do, so that if we no longer can expel children, but we have to find the right community that language, right? I have to find you your right community for you to be served and to be served well. It shifts how we begin to think about the human dignity of the role of students in classroom, because now I'm not kicking you out, I'm moving you to your right place, right? I'm not getting rid of you, I'm not putting you in a prison pipeline. I'm helping you think about what it means to find home that supports you, because I don't know how to do it. So those are some things that I want to think about. I really want to lean into this idea of data and really thinking through how we force foreign corporations and how we force US-based blue chip companies to pay for the access that they have to children. Let's be clear that if we lean into what Carol Lee from Northwestern calls the African model of community education, everybody has a role to play, right? This idea of everybody being a part of this village means that if you participate in the democracy or the economics of what it means to be and do America, you have a right and you have a responsibility in the lives of every child in America. And so I want to push us legislatively to be clear on that. That democratic participation in our economy equals democratic participation in our public schools, because that's your workforce. And if you don't participate in that public economy and the public education system, then you do not belong in playing in our public economy or in our corporate economy, because ultimately you are exploiting and enslaving Black, brown, and all children for the sake of profitable gains, but not putting back in anything to ensure those children have academic success.
Good. Thank you both for sharing so robustly tonight. This has been an excellent Woke Wednesday experience as we talk about just schools, education equity, and 2020. And I gotta just do the shout out that Kenya is very clear that Wi-Fi is like water. Everybody should have it, and it should be free. And I think as we continue this experiment with virtual learning, which may be more long tenured than we expect, these are the kinds of conversations we need to have. Thank you, Dr. Harvey. Thank you, Vice President Bradshaw, for your wisdom, for your organizing, for your thinking, for helping us think on both ends. Kenya particularly helping us think, how do we harvest the power of community and government? And Dr. Harvey, how do we harvest the power of government and capitalism? These are important questions that we need to have in order to build a system of education that works, that is no longer just a assembly line version of what was given to us during the colonial chattel period of our nation. Join us next week as we talk about voting and the economic imagination. We have two great guests prepared for next week, so I hope you'll be with us. Make sure you go and check out thefreedomsummer.org. Sign in there, register there, get connected there, and we can't wait for you to be a part of this movement of Freedom Summer that's going to turn into a Freedom Fall, that's going to turn into the 2021 that we all need after the year we've just experienced. You all take care. Peace.